Okay, we will go ahead and look at Hebrews 6 through 7. That's my main purpose today, which is on the heels of this whole section that we've looked at in verses 1 through 5 that deals with what we'll just call the temporary nature of the tabernacle, right? That it was designed, it's the central place of the old covenant. Without the tabernacle, you can't have a covenant. The Mosaic law falls apart without the tabernacle. If you can't offer sacrifices, if you can't atone for sin, then the entire Mosaic law does not work. It is non-functional, and that is a significant problem if you're seeking to be a Jew, if you want to be a practicing Jewish individual. And so that is part of the problem that we looked at last week, where they have to deal with the Day of Atonement, and they have to deal with all the symbolic kind of nature of the cherubim, of the mercy seat, of the Ark of the Covenant itself, of the incense altar, of the horns that are on that altar, like all of these symbols that were not designed to last forever. They were clearly designed to be replaced by Christ and replaced by a newer, better covenant. So what are they there for? What's their purpose? What do they do? And the whole point that this author is trying to make up to this point is look at how temporary all these symbols are, and that they all point to something better that's down the road, that's coming in the future, and they're not designed to ever be ends and of themselves. They're never designed to stand forever. You have to realize and think from a Jewish perspective, these were people that were convinced their temple was supposed to last forever. Right? They to this day, they believe that they would be offering sacrifices. To this day, they should still be practicing the Day of Atonement. This is a people that were convinced this is the way to God, right here. Right? We have the direct from God's own mouth. We have the commandments, and He tells us precisely how to have a relationship with Him. And as long as we keep doing this, we'll be fine into perpetuity. And we know that's not right. We know that that is an inherent failure to understand the entire purpose of the covenant. And that's kind of the whole idea of it here. In other words, if there's no tabernacle, then there can't be atonement for sin. And if there is no atonement for sin, the whole Mosaic covenant just collapses, all of it. And I will go on record saying the Mosaic law verbatim cannot function without sacrifice. The whole thing, all of it. And there are Reformed people, and very, very good Reformed people, very respectable expository people that will go on record say, if you say that, you're an antinomian. And I want to be very clear about that, just as a side note, before I even go any further into this. Antinomianism is a doctrine that is a little confusing and is misconstrued. So this is something that Paul deals with in Romans 6 and 7. Nomos means law in Greek, and anti, of course, means none. So this is no law. These are people without law. And so an antinomian, by some standards, is someone who says, well, we have grace, we have the gospel, we can do whatever we want because we'll be forgiven, right? That's antinomianism, the idea that you can go out and do whatever you want and there's no need for obedience because you can just be forgiven of it tomorrow anyways, so it's not a big deal. You don't need to be obedient anyway. That's an antinomian. Now, some people will say if you throw out the Mosaic law, you're an antinomian. That is not true. You cannot make that argument on any subset anywhere. No one can read the Gospels with any sense or logic whatsoever and not see that Christ clearly indicates your goal is not to obey the law. Your goal is to be holier than the law, even better than the law. You actually supersede the law. So no one can read the Gospels of Christ with a straight face and say that he's calling for antinomianism. He's clearly expecting obedience from you, but not from Moses. And so that is important. And we can go into the Mosaic law and we can say, sure, there are some moral commandments. There are certainly things of the commandments of Moses that are moral, that are certainly in effect to this day, very theologically, like don't lie, don't commit adultery, etc. What we are arguing for is that you cannot be more righteous by doing that. You're not going to in any way appease the Mosaic law by doing so. You're not gaining relationship with God by doing so. You gain relationship with God through Christ. That's it. That's the whole purpose. So that's the whole goal. And what is fascinating is if you read Hebrews and you read through, I know we are up to chapter 9, you've gone through all of Hebrews, you've seen that really all through all these chapters, his goal has never really been righteousness per se. He's never really talked about righteousness. He's talked a lot about relationship. How can you have access to God? That's the purpose of the Mosaic Law, is to make you good enough to be in his presence, right? That's the goal. Righteousness was not the end goal in and of itself. So anyway, I say all that because this is a common thing that's thrown against, tossed around in these circles. When you deal with someone, if you go up to someone, you say, well, the Mosaic Law is gone. It has no more effect, even if you're technically right. They'll say, well, clearly you just don't. You're an antinomian. You believe in nothing. There's no laws that apply to you whatsoever. No, it's not true. It's a misconstrued. It's a purposeful misconstruction of that term. Now, I want to do verses 6 and 7 and I say all that because this does matter for what I'm about to talk about. And I'm going to retranslate these again. I know I translated them last week, but I'll do this again very briefly. And we'll see that the tone switches from the items in the tabernacle, namely the cherubim that we last week, to the events, the Day of Atonement. So I'm just going to be very quick here. So you have your post-positive, but these, come on now. I'm going to make it pretty small because I'm going to have to fit a lot of words on this page. But these, thus, or therefore, these, but thus, this is a big old verb right here, kates kuos menon. This is a participle, having been prepared or made ready. You make something ready or you're prepping for something. To maintain protein scaning into with the first, pro is first, protein is the first, scaning is tent. The first tent through, this is just a preposition, pontos, all, an inclusive particle, asiason, they enter, or they go in, through which they go in. Okay, so somebody goes in through the first tent, and it's plural. A lot of people do. Hoi eres, who is it? The priests, and this is plural right here. The priests, tas latreos, of the ministry, epi telusentes, they finish, or they complete. Okay, and right now I'm right here at this comma, and then you have this next line here, Ace de tain deuteron. I'm trying to make this big so I can fit it all. But to the second, this is deuteros is number 2 in Greek. Deuteronomy is the second book of the law. So deuteros means second in Greek. The second, apox. This is an interesting word. This is like only once, one time. One time to ereneatu, of the year. Ereneatu is a year. Manas ha archierius. Only the, you might recognize this, you have Arius up here, which is priest. This is archierius. This is high priest or big priest. This is the central priest, the high priest. Hu charis hamiantas, not without blood. Hematology is a study of blood. Hema is blood in Greek. Hematos. He has to come with blood. Which prospheri huper, which he carries or bears on behalf of, huper on behalf of, you're demonstrating some kind of responsibility for something. Iautu, himself, and of the leal, people, or congregation. A lot of people, a large group of people. Ag noes mentam. This is interesting. Errors or mistakes. There is a Greek word for sin. Hamartios is sin. This is not that word for sins. This is a different word, and that's interesting. We're going to get to that here in just a minute. Is it dark in here? Do you guys want to turn on the light? If you want to turn on the light, Mom, go ahead. I know if it was kind of dark in here. Okay, just making sure. It seemed kind of like it got dark. I'm getting used to the darkness early now. Okay, so you have a couple main verbs. Pretty straightforward, right? Now we're dealing with time. We're not dealing with the objects anymore. We're dealing with something specific. An event happens, and it's prepared. Something has been prepared, namely everything that's happened, verses 1 through 5. All the objects have been prepared. Okay? That's important. You read 1 through 5 and you read all these, it talks about the altar, the menorah, the horns of incense, all that has to be set up and prepared. And that's what he says in the beginning of this verse right here. The tabernacle is a tent, right? It's a temporary structure. You have to tear it down and set it back up again. So you have to walk around for a while, and then when you come to a stop, you set it back up. It has to be prepared up front first. All these items have to be set up, and that is exactly what we're dealing with. This is a pretty simple verb talking about the initial setup and preparation of the tabernacle before you can use it. And I've cited a couple examples here to prepare something, right? You see that in Matthew 11. This is John the Baptist. Christ says of John the Baptist, he is the one of which the Isaiah says, "Behold, I send a messenger before your face who will prepare the way before you." 1 Peter 3, the ark was being prepared, right? Had to be built, took time to build it. Luke 7 is, again, John the Baptist. This is the same kind of section as we're talking about in Matthew here. I prepared the way before you. Definitely this idea of setup is my goal. What I'm basically trying to say is that the tabernacle required setup, and then it could be used. And that's important for the next section, which is what? What is set up? Well, first, we know it's 2 tents, but firstly, the first tent has to be set up. And remember this, and I thought I had the drawing in here, but I guess I do not. The tabernacle works on a system of squares, right? And you have the main wall, you have one larger tent, and then inside of that tent, you have the Holy of Holies, which is partitioned off, right? This is a rough drawing, but you know what I'm talking about. There's that one tent that's set up in the middle of the courtyard, and you have one tent into which the priests enter and complete their ministry. And in other words, this is something that happens regularly. You walk around in the desert for a while, for 40 years, you set up the tabernacle, you get everything installed where it's supposed to be, and the priests can go in and do their job regularly. This is mundane. This is something that happens every day. This is something that they're used to. This is something that happens regularly, right? They have to go in there, they have to put oil in the menorah, and they have to replace the table of the showbread, I believe, once a week. I'm not positive on that one. You might have to check me on Exodus on that one, but there's a rotation on how many times they have to prepare the shortbread and put the bread back on the bread of presence. So they have to go in there and do things. What they cannot do is go into the second place, right? In other words, this is special. In other words, what I'm saying is that the author is highlighting the, if you will, to put it bluntly, the mundaneness of this section. The priests go in here. That's normal. That's everyday function. What is not normal is this. And we know that is significant because he says the high priest goes once a year. And we know exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about there's only one time that any one man ever, in the entirety of the Mosaic Law, ever gets to go in there post-Moses. And it's the Day of Atonement. And we know about the Day of Atonement. And we're gonna basically do a quick case study on the entire festival and what we know about it, specifically the liturgical aspect of it. And it's first mentioned in Exodus 30. Okay? This is the first time that God, Yahweh, tells Moses about the Day of Atonement in the law. The law begins being written down in Exodus 20, which is where the Ten Commandments begin to be written. And if you read back through the early high 20s of Exodus, you'll see he starts describing how you're going to build the tabernacle, and it has to be built like this, and the garments of the priests are going to be like this. And then he gets to Exodus 30, and he describes the altar of incense. Now, remember, the altar of incense sits in front of the curtain. So the incense can waft through the curtain. It goes into the Holy of Holies, but no one else can go past there and see what's back there. And so it's described. You cannot offer unauthorized incense on it, or a burnt offering, or a grain offering, or a drink offering. Aaron shall make atonement on its horns once a year, and with the blood of the sin offering of atonement he shall make atonement for it once a year throughout your generations. It is most holy to the Lord. That's the first time you hear very vaguely about the Day of Atonement, and that is completely dropped off. You don't hear anything else about it until Leviticus 16. Okay? You go all the way to Leviticus 16, and we're going to read through sections of this chapter here. We're specifically interested in and what the priest does on that day. We're not so much interested today, at least, in what the general populace did. But you see it first described in Leviticus 16. I'm going to read the very end of the chapter first, because it kind of gives you what I will call the subtitle, the general descriptor. He says, "It shall be a statute to you forever that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict yourselves and do no work, neither the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For on that day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you, and you shall be clean from the Lord from all your sins. It is a Sabbath of solemn rest to you, and you shall afflict yourselves. It is a statute forever. And the priest who is anointed and consecrated as priest in his father's place shall make atonement, wearing the holy linen garments. He shall make atonement for the holy sanctuary. He shall make atonement for the tent of meeting and for the altar. And he shall make atonement for the priests and all the people of the assembly. And this shall be a statute forever to you, that atonement may be made for the people of Israel once a year because of all their sins." And Aaron did as the Lord commanded. Okay, so Aaron's the high priest. He's the initial setup, and they're given this command. And you will see this largely described throughout Leviticus 16. I hope you can read this. I'm trying to fit a ton on one slide, but if you can't, I'm going to kind of highlight a few things. And I'm not going to read this entire thing verbatim. I'm going to highlight a couple things. So this is the description of what happens precisely on that day. Okay? And we know the people are called to fast. The people are called to afflict themselves and do no work. They treat it like a Sabbath. And the high priest has a very specific job that he must accomplish. In this way, Aaron comes into the holy place, okay? He has to have 4 total animals. He's got a bull and a ram for a burnt offering. He's got a bull for sin, a ram for a burnt offering. He's got to put on the special high priest clothes that we talked about, I believe, in chapter 7, maybe 8. He has to bathe, and he shall take from the congregation 2 goats, one for sin, two goats for sin, 1 ram for a burnt offering, and then he has this bull. Now, Aaron has the bull, and that is for himself. Okay? He has to kill this bull and offer it for himself and make atonement for himself and his house. Okay? The bull is for Aaron alone, to make him clean enough to go in there at all. And then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord. And apparently they cast lots over the goats, and one gets to live and the other one gets to die. One is killed, and the other lot 4, you see this interesting term, Azazel. There's not a lot of information on what Azazel means. Even in ancient Hebrew, we don't really know. Apparently it was another term, kind of like cherubim, or a cherub, that was just coined for this purpose. They're describing something specific that, as far as we can tell, is just the wilderness. It's the outcast. It's going out into the wild desert. You're going to die out there. It's not good. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell to the Lord and use it as a sin offering. The goat on which it fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it and be sent away into the wilderness. Okay? So you have your designated animals. This is what has to happen. So first the bull is killed. He presents the bull as a sin offering. He atones for himself. He'll kill it. He takes a censer of coals from the altar before the Lord. Now, this is this incense altar. Okay, this is the golden box, the square altar that sits in front of the curtain. He takes some coals from that fire, 2 handfuls, and bring it inside the veil, that the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat so that he does not die. That's fascinating to me. Almost as a side note, this is almost completely unrelated, but apparently Aaron has to cover the mercy seat with the smoke of the incense so he does not see God directly and die, which is fascinating. This is clean Aaron. After he's been atoned for and after he's clean, he still can't look at God. He cannot see the throne of God directly. He has to cover it up with smoke. He shall take the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat. Okay, so this is the Ark of the Covenant, right? The seat sits on top. He has to sprinkle the blood of the bull first, which is for himself. And he sprinkles that in front of the mercy seat 7 times. Then he shall kill the goat. Okay, here's the goat, and bring its blood inside the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat. Thus he shall make atonement in the holy place, because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel, and because of their transgression. He shall do so for the tent of meeting. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement, until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and his house and the assembly. So this all happens at once. right? He goes in with the bull's blood, then he comes back out, he kills the goat. Secondly, he returns back in the second time and sprinkles the blood of the goat directly on the ark. The blood stains hit the Ark of the Covenant on the top where the seat rests, right? There's actual, in other words, if he did his job right, there should be sprinkles of blood on the top of that golden plate that sits on the top of the box. And he shall go out from that altar that is before the Lord, and then he shall sprinkle, he shall take some blood of the bull and some of the goat, and shall put it on the horns of the altar. Okay? This is the incense altar, right? This is the golden incense box that sits on the other side of the veil, on this side where it is in the holy place, not the holy place, but the holy place. And he sprinkles that too with both the bull and the goat. Both get to be sprinkled there. And cleanse it and consecrate it from the uncleanliness of the people of Israel. And when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place, then he shall present the live goat. Okay, and then we know what happens with the live goat, right? To summarize, he places his hands over the goat. He confesses all the sins of the people and himself onto the goat, and then they send it into the wilderness. Now, you can clearly see the typology of Christ here. Like, this is an obvious type of Christ. There's no way that this is not a type of Jesus Christ who is led out of the city and hung, right, as an outcast, as a scapegoat, right? That was quite literally, he was the scapegoat described right here in Leviticus 16. And then after all that happens, they kind of clean up. He says Aaron has to come back in. He has to wash himself again. The person who leads the goat with Aaron has to wash himself and burn his clothes. And then the rest of the offering, what's left over from the bull and what's left over from the goat, had to be burned with fire. And then after all that's done, they're done. They're allowed to come back into camp. There's a very specific order of all these things. But you can hopefully see, if this event plays out correctly and all these steps are done correctly, then the climax of it is when Aaron comes in and sprinkles blood twice on the mercy seat for himself and for the people. So if his job is done correctly, every year there is blood on the top of the Ark of the Covenant of bulls and goats, and that had to be done regularly, right? So that is the one time that the priest can do this. And hopefully, and I bring this back now to Hebrews, this explains to us two things. If we read verses 6 and 7, one is that there is kind of a mundane atmosphere to which the priests, the regular priests, do their regular work of ministry to the Lord. But that is secondary to the highlighted nature of what the high priest does. And he can do nothing, as we see from the text up here, without blood. The whole understanding of this is you cannot go and see God without blood. You cannot go into the Holy of Holies, look at God without blood that is atoning for you and someone else. It is impossible to see God unless someone died. And we know this is ultimately, this is the gospel in a nutshell, right? This is everything we believe about the holiness of God. You cannot see the throne of God unless there's blood sprinkled on it for your sake. And that is literally Christ in a nutshell. There's not a more clear picture of Christ's death and resurrection than that right there. I don't know, if you cannot see the typology there, I don't know how else to help you, because he demonstrates there that he can only go one time to see God, and he can only do it with blood, and he does it for himself and for others. This is fascinating too, because we looked at this in chapter 8. This is really a summary of what we discussed in chapter 8, which is that Christ is not just the sacrifice. He's the priest that administers his own sacrifice. He's the doer and the one dying. He does both, right? He can be your high priest and the sacrifice simultaneously. And that is exactly what's happening here. The high priest is the type and the goat is the type. All of this is a giant type of Christ in every possible way. So all of this is full of the typology of the fact that the author is demonstrating Christ is everywhere in the tabernacle, and arguably the most important function of the priesthood, the most important function of the tabernacle, the most important day of the year, for all of them, for the ministers, for the priests, for the blood, for the whole covenant, is nothing but a giant finger that points to Christ. That's it. That's all it does. In no way can it atone for, in other words, this entire system is designed to point to the fact that the blood of the animals doesn't help you at all. The blood of animals isn't going to atone for anything. What's going to atone for something is Christ. And a couple commentators make that point. I'm going to read them very briefly here. One commentator says, the frustrating tension was hardly alleviated, I misspelled that, by the one day of the year, the Day of Atonement, when the high priest actually did go into God's presence. The verses tell us that only he entered only on that day, only with blood from the sacrifice to cover his sins and those of the people. Far from minimizing the separation of the holy God and his unholy people, that one day emphasized it all the more. The Day of Atonement proclaimed that the way was in fact barred. Okay? And we're going to get to that in verses 8 through 10. And you're going to see that next week in the coming verses, that the way is shut unless you have blood. So imagine, just if we put ourselves in the mindset of a priest, a regular priest, who's not the high priest, whose entire job is to go in there on a regular basis, and his life depends upon filling the lamp and replacing the showbread, and you know God is right there, right behind this curtain. He's right there, and you cannot see him, right? You are within rocks throwing distance of the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat, but he's cut off from you. You cannot see God, right? All of this emphasizes separation. Then one other commentator says the plurality of the priests and the regularity of their activities in the outer section are stark contrast to the high priest's solitary and infrequent entrance into the tabernacle's second chamber. Three differences set apart worship from the first section from that in the second. One, into the former, many priests enter, whereas the high priest alone enters the latter. Two, the priests fulfill their tasks regularly, and the high priest enters only once a year. And three, those familiar with regulations would know that the regular tasks involve no shedding of blood, whereas the high priest entered the latter not without blood. So Levites can fill the menorah all day long, and they can replace the showbread all day long. They can even offer burnt offerings and sacrifices on the bronze altar outside, but they cannot make atonement, so to speak. Does that make sense? They cannot atone directly for the sins before God himself. They can offer sacrifices. They can do the regular work. They're there all day long killing animals and demonstrating through blood that they are atoning for individuals, but they cannot make atonement in God's sight, right in front of the mercy seat. And that's what we're dealing with here. So, all of this highlights the need for Christ, because the author points all this out to make clear the tabernacle is temporary. It's all one big thing that points to something greater. Priests can't atone for your sin. Even the high priest, who comes in once a year, if nothing else, actually highlights even more the fact that you're separated from God, right? Only one very specific person can see God one time, and only if he does very specific things, right? And we know this also, and I'm kind of laying one of my cards on the table here, but if we look forward at Hebrews 10, he says, for since the law has but a shadow of good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. The laws can't make you perfect, and the sacrifices can't make you perfect. They're of no value. Otherwise, they would not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices, there is reminder of sins every year. That's huge. I'm fast forwarding now. I'm giving up a study I'm going to probably do later. But note what he says there. He says they can't in no way make you perfect. And otherwise, they would keep doing them. What do they do then? If they can't make you perfect, what are they doing? They're reminders. That's huge. All of this, the whole system, the Day of Atonement, the uncounted animals that were killed, the uncounted people that stood in line to be atoned for, all of that is one giant reminder. The whole thing, the entire system is built to remind you how sinful you are. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. That is amazing. Consider consider if Aaron in Moses' time read this line. That bull and the goat that you just killed in the Day of Atonement can't take away anybody's sin. It does nothing. It's completely useless in terms of being effectual for sin, right? It is impossible for animal blood to atone for your sin. And we know this logically, right? If you're a sinner and you've sinned before God, and let's say you're a murderer, on what level do you think God is appeased by the blood of a subconscious, amoral animal? How does that make anything right? Right? All of this is supposed to point to a need for a serious sacrifice that does matter, right? Because none of this takes away any sins. So, when I say all of its laws and decrees and works are useless, I'm saying useless in the salvific sense, right? None of it saves. It doesn't make anybody perfect. Otherwise, you'd still be doing it to this day. But it reminds you of something significant, that sin requires blood. Without blood, sin doesn't go away. Which means by proxy, without blood, there's no access to God. There's no relationship with the Father. You can't get past the curtain into the inner tent. You cannot see God. You cannot have a relationship with Him. He's not going to, right? Because someone has to die. So now, what's fascinating, and one last thing I want to highlight about this section, is probably the most unusual Greek word here, which is hag noe meton. This is a word for, and you can see this at the end of verse 7. He carries the blood in on behalf of himself and the people's errors. Is actually the word for mistake, for error. And that's a very different word choice. I believe most of your English translations will say sins, but this is unintentional sins. And I triple checked this. Here's 2 different Greek grammarians here. There is a word for sin. It's hamartia right here, actually. Crimes. Hamartia is you willingly know that you're doing wrong. Okay? You sin and you know full well that you're sinning. You do it anyway. That's hamartia in Greek. Okay? That is a deliberate, willful sin that you know full well is against the holiness of God. This word is very unusual, and it's only used here. This is its only use in Greek New Testament. It actually comes from a word agnao. Agnao. You think of the agnostic. Agnostics claim, well, I don't know anything. I don't know if God exists or not. I don't know. I'm just ignorant. That's agnao. Know nothing is the understanding here. This is, it comes from that word for unintentional. It's a mistake. It's an error, like an oversight. It's not necessarily like an intended sin. And that's fascinating to find here. One grammarian says the errors of the people is how he would translate this. Late word from agnao, not to know, only here in the New Testament, but it's found in the LXX, the Papyrian inscription. So the LXX is the Greek Old Testament. In Genesis 43:12, it's an oversight. These are sins of ignorance, and they were sins that called for atonement. So this is fascinating because here we're getting into a distinction that we touched on briefly in Hebrews chapter 7, which is there is at least, even if not necessarily in atonement, but in reconciliation, some sort of category of sin in the Old Testament where there were just mistakes. However, there's still got to be atoned for, right? And no, you say, well, does that mean, okay, well, is there greater sins that are willful sins that are absolutely crimes before God? Absolutely. Does that mean the unintentional ignorant sins are not as condemned before God? No. Unintentional sins still have to have atonement. He has to bring blood for the mistakes. So we're not even in the realm right now of the willful sins, of the crimes that people genuinely desire to bring about. This is just the fact that God absolutely still requires you to be perfect and holy from what we'll call unintentional sins, what we'll call oversights, mistakes, a sense in which you were ignorant in your sins. You say, well, how does that work? How is anyone ignorant in their sin? Well, the first category is an unbeliever, by far, right? You think of all kinds of people right now. Like, imagine someone in the heart of Mecca in Saudi Arabia right now. They never heard the gospel in their life, and they live in sin, and they genuinely may have no idea because they never even heard the Mosaic covenant before, right? Or the law of Moses or the scriptures whatsoever. They're ignorant in their sins. Does that mean that they are lesser sinners by some degree than someone who knows the law? No. And I thought I had it up here on the slide, but the first thing that I thought I wrote it down. But if you look at Romans 3, right, what does Paul say at the end of it? He says, Jews are under sin and Greeks are under sin. The Greeks didn't have any law, right? That was part of his point in Romans chapter 2. They were lawless. They didn't have any Moses. They had no laws whatsoever. Does that mean they somehow are unguilty? Absolutely not. And there is a sense in which what the author of Hebrews is saying here is that even the Jewish people were unintentional and ignorant in how sinful they were towards God. And I remember, I think it might have been Ray Comfort that said this a long time ago. He says, "You do not know how sinful you are on a day-by-day, minute-by-minute basis until you think about when Christ said, the greatest law is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind." Can you say that you did that every minute today? You didn't. I didn't. We certainly do not, right? And there's no possible way a human being can do that on a regular basis. We are more sinful than we know. And that's exactly what was true in 1500 BC, right, with these Jewish people. Ignorant and mistaking sins. And the bottom line is God still holds unintentional or ignorant sin accountable. It may be ignorant. You may even sympathize to a degree with someone who doesn't know any better, but that doesn't mean that when they stand before God, the law will change that they're being judged by. The standard will still be the same. We're not safe simply because you have no memory or did not intend to sin. God still views it as evil regardless, and therefore it requires blood. And this hopefully highlights kind of the significance of all of this. In other words, one of the implications then is that the Day of Atonement is like the catch-all day. The Day of Atonement is the day when Aaron can correct everything else that no one else corrected. If we were honest and genuine and we lived in the Mosaic law, you would never leave the tabernacle because you would be so sinful. You would always be sacrificing, right? There would never be an end to the amount of sacrifices you would have to sacrifice. You could not possibly sacrifice enough. So, to make the point even clearer of just how sinful we are and how in need of atonement we have to be, there's a catch-all festival day that God designed every year to remind you that there are sins that you don't even know how sinful you are that has to be atoned for. That's how significant this is. And Christ pays for intentional and ignorant sin, right? Christ's blood and his atonement cover all sin infinitely on every scale. So hopefully all of this kind of demonstrates, if nothing else, just how gracious and merciful the mercy seat is, right? That even the sins you're not even aware of that you committed today, that we don't even have capacity to understand, have been atoned for by Christ. This is a statement of grace. So I'm going to go ahead and close it there. But the atonement of Christ is showcased by his blood upon the mercy seat. So I'm talking about the fact that every year Aaron or the high priest went in there and there would be blood stains on the top of the Ark of the Covenant for intentional sins and sins that human beings weren't even capable of understanding they committed, because that needs atoning too. And Christ's blood is the only way that is possibly removed, right? Because even theoretically speaking, if this covenant still existed and the Mosaic law was still in effect, and you could never, you don't own enough animals that you could kill. You would run out of animals to kill for all your sins. And B, that there is no way that the unintentional sins that you committed on a regular basis could even be covered up by enough blood every year before you died. You would run out. So hopefully, the whole point of this whole chapter, Hebrews 9, is the author kind of constricting the neck, if you will, of the Old Covenant. He's slowly choking them out of their doctrinal position. He's slowly closing the noose a little bit at a time and showing them that there's no way you can make it work today. It can't work. it's going to fall apart. There's no way you can sacrifice enough. There's no way there's enough atonement. There's no way there's enough animals on this planet or enough temples to hold them all for all the sin.